Hello, you're listening to the introductory episode of the Statelessness and Exclusion Dialogues podcast. The series is brought to you by the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion. I'm your host, Andy Clark. In this podcast series, we're trying to better understand the link between structural discrimination and statelessness in the world today. For this short introductory episode, I'm joined by Amal.
Hi Andy, my name is Amal de Chickera. I'm a human rights lawyer and I am one of the co-founders and co-directors of the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion.
Amal, what can we expect in the series?
So this is a series in which we try to unpick some quite fundamental and deep questions around the way statelessness, which is the condition of not having any nationality, is impacted by discrimination and discriminatory treatment and discriminatory practices on various grounds. And as the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion, we felt it was very important to engage in this kind of an inquiry and interrogation into the way statelessness relates to discrimination, because what we have found through our work, through our engagement with partners around the world, is that often the motivating root causes behind statelessness are based on discrimination on a particular ground or characteristic. And this has been an area of statelessness studies and research and activism which has, we felt, I wouldn't say been neglected, but which we feel hasn't got the attention it deserves, and where we feel that there's a lot more that has to be done. So we feel very privileged to have been able to pull together a number of fabulous experts from around the world whose lives and whose work very much relate to this question of the way statelessness relates to different forms of discrimination. And I'm really looking forward to the podcast series.
Yeah, we've spoken to these experts in the series, as you say, and I think people listening probably have a global understanding of what statelessness is. But what is it really? What is statelessness and how does it relate to discrimination? And what are some of the historical and contemporary causes?
If I was to break that question down into its kind of composite components and first take the part of what is statelessness. So in terms of the technical legal definition of statelessness, it is the condition of not having the nationality of any state. So a stateless person is defined under international law as someone who is not considered a national by any state under the operation of its law. Now, this definition on the face of it is quite neutral. It kind of is represented in a very matter-of-fact, blasé kind of way, the same way you would define many things in law. But if you actually look under this definition and you look at the question of what statelessness really is, what the experience of statelessness is, and how people actually are made stateless, you would find that discrimination rooted in some of the biggest social challenges, the biggest forms of historical exclusion of peoples and communities, is at the root of statelessness. So we would see, for example, that most stateless people belong to minority communities, and minorities actually represent a significant percentage of stateless people in the world. You would also see that women are in many countries, in 24 countries around the world, do not have equal rights to pass on their citizenship to their children, and in around 50 countries in the world do not have equal rights to acquire citizenship or to transfer it to their spouses. And this is rooted obviously in the patriarchy and in gender discrimination. You would also find that xenophobia and increasing authoritarianism, increasing populism are all factors which play into the way groups are treated, othered, and told that they do not belong, and on that basis they are made stateless.
And these are all issues we'll be looking at in depth in the series, of course. What do you hope the series will achieve?
I mean, I hope that it'll bring some useful insights into what is quite a complex question. I think it'll provoke. I hope it'll provoke discussion and debate. One thing that I would love to see changing is further progression away from what has become quite a lazy narrative of looking at statelessness as a technical accident of history and something that can be rectified purely by changing a law, when the reason it isn't rectified is because the motivations to maintain the status quo are very much likely to continue. And so I would love for listeners to this podcast, to recognize that when we talk about statelessness, we're actually talking about an issue which is deeply connected to many of the other issues of social injustice and social justice in the world. And that statelessness then becomes an integral component of those issues. And it becomes a necessary component when we also talk about how to take forward social justice issues on those other matters. So we cannot talk about addressing race discrimination in the world without talking about the way in which race discrimination causes and perpetuates and further discriminates against stateless people. And similarly, we cannot talk about dismantling the patriarchy without talking about the way the patriarchy relates to statelessness. We cannot talk about the legacy of colonialism without looking at the way colonialism was probably, and the process of decolonization, that the two hand in hand, were probably the largest kind of factor in causing and perpetuating statelessness. And if our listeners take from this podcast this deeper, more nuanced understanding of statelessness, this recognition that statelessness is connected to other global issues, and thereby an acknowledgement that addressing those other global issues also requires addressing statelessness, I would then be delighted.
And is there something from the series, an insight that you've heard that has inspired you, that gives you hope looking forward?
I mean, I think I certainly am inspired by the way civil society working on statelessness has been kind of grappling with the issue and also grappling with the way we are organized as a global community. I think one of the important considerations, if you're serious about talking about addressing discrimination and addressing the discriminatory impacts of statelessness, is also to be introspective, to look at the way privilege plays a role in how people are also able to work on this issue. Historically, the statelessness space has been dominated by academics, by NGO professionals, by UN agencies, and there is a growing acknowledgement that this is unacceptable and that work on statelessness has to be led by stateless people, and that organizations such as ISI, our role is to be supportive and to create the space and to seed that space for stateless-led organizations and for stateless individuals. It's quite a significant shift that is happening. Some people will say it's happening too slowly. Other people will say that it took too long to even begin happening. And I would potentially agree with both of those statements. But it is happening. And it is happening because there is a recognition, both from NGO groups and from groups of people who are stateless and who have lived experience of statelessness, that this must happen, that it's long overdue. By analogy, it would be deemed completely unacceptable for a heterosexual cis man to speak on behalf of LGBTQI rights. But what we have had in the statelessness field for far too long is people with no lived experience of statelessness speaking on behalf of the rights of stateless people. And this is something that we are trying to change. And I think even in the podcast series, there would have been various examples of the way in which this is changing, about people taking control of their own narratives, about people with lived experience of statelessness emerging as the real true leaders of the statelessness field. And to me, this is extremely encouraging. It's extremely exciting. There's a lot of work that we still have to do, but I feel like we are moving in the right direction.
You've been listening to the introductory episode of the Statelessness and Exclusion Dialogues podcast, brought to you by the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion. The series itself will examine different themes impacting statelessness in the coming episodes. These include the history of colonialism, patriarchy, state formation, xenophobia and racism, and digital ID and documentation. If you'd like to know more about the work of the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion, then visit the website institutesi.org. institutesi.org. I'm Andy Clark. Thanks for listening.